Hello and welcome to the Haaretz Podcast. I'm Alison Kaplan-Summer in Tel Aviv. Under the parliamentary system of government in Israel, the rules are supposed to be pretty clear. There are 120 seats in the Knesset. A party that's able to put together a majority coalition of 61 seats controls the government. If it isn't able to do that, the government falls and new elections are held. Simple, right? Well, it turns out in Israel in 2025, nothing's really simple. As of last week, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's government fell from 67 seats to 49 seats. And yet, new elections are not at all imminent. Here with me to talk about what happened, the reasons around it, and what might occur if there are new elections in the near future is Haaretz columnist and political analyst and strategist, Dr. Dahlia Scheindlin. My conversation with Dahlia is coming up.
I'm Esther Solomon, Editor-in-Chief of Haaretz English. Around the world, the fight is on to preserve critical and independent media. Haaretz, Israel's oldest newspaper, upholds its long tradition of accurate, committed, and incisive journalism, refusing to bend its reporting to pressure from any government or leader. A digital subscription to Haaretz gives you up-to-the-minute news and analysis in English from journalists who live Israel's reality and are committed to covering the Middle East and its global repercussions. At the same time, your subscription supports the cause of a free press that holds the powerful to account in Israel and around the world. I invite you to become a subscriber to Haaretz now. Just go to Haaretz.com and use the code Haaretz10, that's Haaretz with the number 10, for 10% off an annual subscription.
Dr. Dahlia Scheindlin, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me back, Alison.
Dahlia, can we start with you walking us through exactly what played out politically last week? How precisely did Benjamin Netanyahu lose his majority in the Knesset?
Okay. Well, for one thing, the entire time of the war and the entire history of Israel, it's worth remembering that the ultra-Orthodox, the Jewish population who is by definition isolationist and tries to be as little integrated as possible into the main institutions of modern life, have enjoyed a blanket draft exemption from IDF conscription. Again, that goes back to the beginning of statehood, but in the time of this war, it's become particularly an emotional factor. It has always made Israelis extremely angry. And over the years, there have been many attempts by citizens to challenge that state of affairs. To cut a very long, 4-decade history short, I'll just say that Israelis have taken the government to court over this issue. The Supreme Court has ruled numerous times and in various ways that there must be legislation in Israel that eventually drafts the ultra-Orthodox so that there can be equality between all citizens over the issue of the draft. And each time Israeli governments have tried to pass a law or even write a law that would involve drafting the ultra-Orthodox, it runs into the basic problem that the ultra-Orthodox do not want to be drafted, and the courts and the Israeli public, of course, believe that there should be equality of the draft and that they should be drafted. Now, because most Israeli governments, but certainly all of Netanyahu's governments, are coalition governments that depend on the votes and the participation of the ultra-Orthodox parties, they have a lot of leverage. So if they don't like a draft law because it's too punitive, right? Because what these laws try to do is conscript them according to some sort of framework that involves certain kinds of punishment for people who avoid getting drafted. And if the ultra-Orthodox parties don't like it, they think it's too punitive, they think it will ultimately result in too many people having to be drafted when that community would prefer for its people to stay inside yeshivot, religious seminaries their whole lives. And so if they think that it's going to actually result in too many people being drafted, they simply threaten to leave the coalition. This has happened numerous times over the course of Israeli history, and it has happened numerous times in ways that ultimately bring down a government. The argument between the more secular parties and any coalition who do want to draft the ultra-Orthodox and the ultra-Orthodox parties who resist being drafted into the IDF, and that's often how governments fall. So this is not exactly an exception In fact, one might say the main exception is that the government hasn't exactly fallen. And that's where it gets confusing, but also, is an accurate characterization of what happened last week. That's a long answer to your original question. But last week, the two ultra-Orthodox parties, Shas and United Torah Judaism, made good on threats that they had basically been threatening for a number of months at this point, that if the government was unable to pass a law that would be satisfactory to them, in other words, sufficiently favorable that not too many people in those ultra-Orthodox communities would be drafted according to their criteria of what counts as not too many, then they would leave the government. But of course, again, after the Supreme Court has really brought the issue to a head, or not the Supreme Court, but the citizens who have petitioned the Supreme Court over the years, the Supreme Court has issued, very unambiguous rulings that there must be a law passed that actually advances equality in the draft. And so that is the gap between the two. The ultra-Orthodox parties had threatened that they would bolt the government if it was unable to pass a law that was satisfactory to them, i.e. not drafting too many of them. And the government, to hold together, Netanyahu has basically been trying to convey to the ultra-Orthodox parties that he would that he would find a way to advance a law that was to their liking, while trying to tell the Israeli public and the Israeli courts that that the government would advance a law that does draft as many of the ultra-Orthodox as possible. So, because the government was unable to advance a version that satisfied the ultra-Orthodox, let's say, then those parties finally, after lots of threats, both one after the other, exited the government and the coalition. But what does that actually mean? The government had 67-seat majority out of 120. Now it has 49 or 50, depending on how you count, based on a little bit of a complication over whose resignation has gone into effect, but it doesn't have a majority anymore. However, that only means that the government would fall if there's a key vote on an issue, for example, particularly the vote on disbanding the Knesset. And if those parties do not actually join such a vote, right, they've left the government and the coalition in a very demonstrative way, but if they don't actually join a vote that would bring down the government and launch early elections, it doesn't really matter. And that kind of a vote is not expected to happen until the Knesset comes back from its summer recess, and the Knesset will reconvene only in mid-October. So there's basically a longish window of time during which their exit from the coalition is essentially a matter of holding kind of political sword over Netanyahu's head, over the government's head, saying, we are poised to bring down this government now and launch early elections. There's a nice leisurely window of time in which you could still advance a law to our liking.
So even if the Knesset was theoretically in session, even if the opposition decided to vote to dissolve the government without the votes of these ultra-Orthodox parties, you couldn't make the government fall, right? It's going to stay together as long as the ultra-Orthodox refuse to vote against holding the government together, and it could continue indefinitely as a minority government.
That's true. There's nothing in Israeli law that says we can't have a minority government. Minority governments have existed before. They usually have a very short lifespan because the parties that have left seem to want to bring the government down usually. Now, in this case, it's like so many things about this government, a little bit different. The parties have theoretically, declaratively, maybe even ceremonially left, but they do not seem to truly want to bring down the government. And there's very good reason for that. So just to say, you are absolutely correct that as the opposition has not been able to bring down the government by definition up until now, because the government has a voting majority, as most governments do. And even the fact that it's now a minority government, in a way, it doesn't matter that much if those parties that have left don't join the opposition to reach a majority who would vote for disbanding the Knesset and launching early elections. And I think that the main thing to keep in mind is that both the ultra-Orthodox parties and every other party in the current coalition do not really have an interest in early elections. Even though early elections it's all relative, because in any case, elections are scheduled to be held by late 2026, October, November. But they would like to stave off that process for as long as possible. That's because they're very unlikely to have a better situation in any future government, according to all polls. Actually, all polls that have been taken since January 2023. The current government the original coalition has not been able to win a majority of seats in any poll except for those that are really right-wing crony polls. And even those show very slim majority for those coalition parties. That is actually less than they originally had, the 64 seats they originally had. So they don't really have any interest in holding the elections sooner. But they do have an interest in trying to threaten the government and pressure the government and to try to make it seem like they will really bring this government down.
Do you think if it wasn't for October 7th, if it wasn't for the war, that they would have their law already and they would be exempt from service?
It's very hard to say because that's a counterfactual, but I will say that the issue of Israel's historic draft exemption and the fight over this kind of law, or the fight over how to create a framework in which they can both preserve their lifestyle at some level, right? Because this is the whole argument. I mean, if the Israeli state didn't care one way or another about how ultra-Orthodox want to live their lives and wasn't committed to supporting them, then they would simply say, we're drafting you. That's it. Do what you want. Live your lives as you want. But you have to be drafted like everybody else. But the Israeli state has wanted to give them those kinds of concessions, allow them to essentially live an isolationist life, very often at the expense of the state, because it wants those parties in the governing coalition. And that goes back to a much deeper issue, which is that most Israeli parties, Zionist parties that have been called upon to form governments, the vast majority of them, almost all of them, have not wanted to depend on the additional Knesset seats voting mandates to reach a majority based on the Arab parties in Israel. And as a result, they almost always choose the ultra-Orthodox parties. And so to satisfy them, they're always willing to give these concessions. That's been a historic kind of dilemma, but it's not really a dilemma. The parties of Israel have always solved that dilemma by giving the concessions to the ultra-Orthodox. And so on the one hand, it could be that they would have finally, reached a law that was just that much tilted on the side of the preferences of the ultra-Orthodox parties. On the other hand, it would have been challenged forever, and it could very well have brought down government anyway, which it has before, right? The last government before the cycle of 5 elections, right? That government that fell in late 2018 fell for the same reason, because Avigdor Lieberman's party, Israel Beitenu, was not willing to accept the kind of compromise then being discussed for the ultra-Orthodox and bolted the government back then. It's sort of an ongoing cycle. And as long as these things remain unresolved, and then the governments drag out their lives until the next elections and then everything is on hold, it remains unresolved. And especially with the Supreme Court rulings that have become tougher over the years, requiring the government to pass a law that reaches that satisfies the standards of equality of all citizens, it's hard to know how long the cycle could have gone in the same way, but it's also impossible to count on any resolution of this issue because it's never been resolved in the history of the country.
Dahlia, this week, the political subplot of this whole affair centers around Yuli Edelstein. He's a member of Knesset, former minister, and now he's head of the Knesset's Security and Foreign Affairs Committee. That was a job that was given to him sort of instead of being named a minister. So why does he appear right now to be the victim of this whole episode?
First of all, I have a very hard time looking at Yuli Edelstein as a victim of anything, but he has been advancing a version of the law that would be just a little bit tougher in terms of the kind of punitive sanctions that would be meted out to the ultra-Orthodox communities if they are avoiding the draft. And, there is a split within Likud over this issue. It's one of the issues that does divide the right wing in Israel. It even divides, and in a way, one of the more interesting divisions is within the religious Zionist community, and of course within the party religious Zionism, but certainly within Likud, because the issue of people being drafted is such an open wound in Israeli life, particularly during the phase of this war since October 7th. So there are members of Likud, there are factions, there are certainly Likud voters, as there are many religious Zionist voters who desperately want the ultra-Orthodox to be drafted to end the situation in which, their family members are serving in the war and dying all the time. But the ultra-Orthodox have this exemption and they see it as, something absolutely intolerable. So, Yuli Edelstein kind of said, I'm representing that side of our voter base. And there has to be a law that does effectively raise the number of ultra-Orthodox who will eventually be drafted. And therefore, I'm going to have certain items within the law that really make it harder for ultra-Orthodox people not to be drafted. Punitive, primarily economic sanctions. But ultimately, Netanyahu and the Likud want to get to a situation where the ultra-Orthodox are sufficiently satisfied to stay in the government. And so in a way, there's a breakthrough here because the Likud and Netanyahu are conveying more explicitly than ever before that they are simply about to sacrifice the value that Israelis, that the vast majority of Jewish Israelis, I should say at least, uh, you know, are really committed to, which is getting the ultra-Orthodox drafted. And they are prepared to simply sacrifice the serious kinds of measures that would be needed to do that in order to keep the coalition together. Some commentators, I think correctly, are looking at this as the first time the government has made it extremely clear that its political interests override the good of the state. Now, we can debate what's the good of the state. Personally, I think the good of the state should be to end this war for any number of reasons, chief among them because Israel is frankly abusing and destroying the people of Gaza. We will, none of us can forget what's going on in Gaza right at this minute, the levels of starvation and suffering and really, displacement and complete destruction. But also because Israeli families are losing their soldiers every day. And what you hear most often from the parents is why? Why are we losing our children for a politicized war? And up until now, that's been sort of a political opinion. But I think that this really shows that the government is prepared to do anything to stay in power, even if it means, deepening this fundamental inequality of who has to serve in the war. And it has no intention of ending that war, of course, which is a slightly different issue, but of course deeply connected because it just means the people who are serving will continue to serve and die while the ultra-Orthodox are not serving at all.
Yeah, we have a column up today in Haaretz by Ravit Hecht noting that, quote, anyone in Likud who has tried to take a principled stand on conscription, whether it was former Defense Minister Yoav Gallant, who has basically lost his job for exactly the same reason, or now Edelstein, finds himself on the exit ramp to oblivion. Do you think Edelstein's going to oblivion?
I don't know if he's going to oblivion, but I think Ravit Hecht's article is spot on. Ultimately, the Likud is prepared to sacrifice people in its party. And what I think is almost more important is it's prepared to sacrifice people like Gallant. Again, not because I have any personal affection for the guy, but, this isn't a matter of my personal assessment, but it's a matter of what counts in a populist government. Gallant came from a military background and he was defense minister, and yet the government was essentially willing to sacrifice him, despite the fact that he's much more professionally competent than the current defense minister, Israel Katz, because it had its political considerations. And that's an interesting example, but I think that, the same principle applies in the sense that, yes, the government is willing to do away with anyone who does not fall into line with the highest priority, which is its political considerations. So I certainly agree with Ravit Hecht's analysis.
Which compromises our security as Israeli citizens for purely political reasons, which, is kind of horrifying in a country where security is supposed to be the primary consideration.
That's true, but I think that we're way past that. In other words, October 7th was the most stunning example of the government having compromised the security of the people for its political interests. And the political interests at the time were to pass, the package of reforms that would have undermined and eviscerated, frankly, the independence of the Israeli judiciary. Never mind that the government has managed to continue doing exactly that, with both, under the cover of the war and in various ways reverting even to the original reforms that it was trying to pass. That's ultimately what happened over the course of 2023. It was a government that simply stopped paying attention to what governments do. And the basic contract between citizens and their government is that the government keeps them safe, first of all. And this government, as we know now, repeatedly just didn't pay attention to security warnings. And those warnings, I've been rereading a lot of the warnings that came out in March from the defense minister, in July from the chief of staff and from the head of the Air Force. They were saying two things. They were saying, first of all, enemies are watching, they see our vulnerabilities. But what they were saying, much more explicitly was that the kinds of, the fundamental rift that you have created within Israeli society is so bad that it's deep, that it's breaking people's morale, which is in a way, the basis of democratic participation is that people are voluntarily participating in the social institutions, and among them the army. Now, it's true, the army is a mandatory institution in Israeli society, but motivation has always been a very, very, outstanding feature of life in Israel. And when you have mass numbers of people who simply could not commit themselves to serving a state that they felt was going to violate their individual rights and their civil liberties, then you have serious weakness of motivation and resources for the armed forces. And these officials that I mentioned were making that case very explicitly to the prime minister, and the government didn't care. I guess the religious fundamentalists thought God will provide. right? The messianic mission is more important than these, earthly concerns of this moment. And the prime minister apparently was thinking anything to keep my coalition together. And that's what led us to the situation where Hamas was able to carry out, the worst terror attack in Israeli history. The blame lies first and foremost with Hamas for carrying out that attack, but Israel's failures to detect, prevent, and respond, I think the public certainly blames the government very severely for that.
Dahlia, on to your favorite topic, the polls. You caution in your latest column in Haaretz that the current polls are, in your word, enigmatic because the political parties of today are not going to be the parties running in the elections. But is there anything you can say, even with partial confidence, about trends that these polls are pointing to in terms of what the direction might be for voters in the next election? And obviously, we know the biggest question that our listeners probably want answered. What are the odds that Netanyahu will hang on to power?
Well, I'd love to be able to give, perfect predictions and odds and probabilities. But frankly, I think that most of these forecasting models that have become popular around the world are not terribly serious, to be honest. I mean, there are so many factors that influence the answer to that question. Polls are one of them. And polls, we should really understand, are not a tool for prediction. They are great at analyzing trends up until now. And up until now, we have seen some very clear trends, despite, my word of caution. My word of caution is because, yes, the party system will change significantly before the elections. Parties always merge and appear out of nowhere and collapse and form all sorts of new configurations. So what we're seeing today is a little bit hard to decode because polls have started to test all sorts of hypothetical parties or parties that, like Naftali Bennett's that exist, but we don't really know what their value will be. However, as you correctly point out, because apparently you read my column very closely, there are some remarkably stable factors about polling in Israel really ever since the start of this government and certainly since the war began. In a way, it makes it easy for pollsters because the trends have been so consistent. The main thing to keep in mind is that the government had no grace period after it was established in late 2022. It lost its majority in all surveys throughout 2023, not by a huge margin, in a way, a normal margin, just one that would have taken longer for most governments because they have that grace period. And then after the war began, after October 7th, the government's ratings plunged because people, just could not even comprehend the failures of the government. And they lost about a third of their support. It was the opposite of a rallying effect. And those polls were abysmal for the government for about the first 6 months. But since roughly April 2024, the government slowly and incrementally began to recover back to where it was before the war. So not exactly the same majority that it was able to win in 2022, but roughly in the low 50 seat range out of 120. So again, between, let's say, 48, 49 and 53, 54 seats, sometimes a little bit higher, but with no real stable upward trend beyond what looks like a ceiling of about 53 or 54 seats, again, out of 120. So not really approaching the majority it would need. But the thing to keep in mind is that in Israel's parliamentary system, the way the election system works, like in many systems, you don't necessarily need an absolute majority of all the voters in order to become the party that leads the next government. Just to give you an example, the current government, the parties of the coalition, and they were 4 parties at the time. Now, since they've broken up, there's sort of 5 parties in the original coalition. In the 2022 elections back in November 2022, they won a total of 48.3% of all the votes cast. Without getting into all of the technicalities about how those calculations work, if you simply add up all of the percentages that voted for those parties, it's not a majority. And what the government has now, by my assessment of both these electoral trends we're talking about and a number of other questions that are asked about policy and directions in Israeli society and positions of the prime minister, what you really see is that there's a very stable core of something like 37 or 8 up to 42, 43% of all Israelis who pretty much support this government on anything. So if you say upper range is pretty consistently within roughly the 43% range, all it needs is another 5% to recreate something like the success that the original parties of this coalition had in 2022. So it's not impossible, even based on current polling, that they can cover that gap. The other option is that Netanyahu, being the master engineer of the Israeli political scene, can find a way to, encourage the right party configurations, just as he encouraged religious Zionism and the Jewish Power Party, both of them Jewish supremacist, religious fundamentalist parties.
And suppress the Arab vote.
Suppress the Arab vote, I think that it's a little bit more complicated. I mean, there were certainly times when Netanyahu tried openly to discourage the Arab vote, but I think that ultimately, everybody in Israel who is a citizen has the franchise, and it's the responsibility of those voters to go vote. Now, there are a lot of reasons why the Arab voters feel, very disillusioned about the voting system, many reasons. But I think that efforts at intimidation, which I think that's the better way to put it would be efforts at intimidation that we've seen in the past from this government against the Arab vote are certainly completely unacceptable in a democratic society. Even a bare minimum of an electoral democracy, if Israel is, can really no longer be considered a liberal democracy. Now, it could very likely be the case that those efforts become even more institutionalized over the next elections. There are efforts to, for example, ban certain Arab candidates from running in elections. And it's very short leap between that and finding ways to disenfranchise Arab voters. But I think that if I could speak to all of the Palestinian citizens of Israel, I would say, every single person still has the franchise if they're over 18, and it's really up to us. I say us collectively as citizens, Jews and Palestinian citizens alike, to go and use that vote. But the point is that Netanyahu does know how to mastermind the party system so that even if, he doesn't have a clear outright, over 50% of the votes for the parties that initially support him, that even after the elections, he knows how to do coalition bargaining better than anybody else in the Israeli political system. So it is certainly a potential outcome that he could become the next prime minister. I can't put a number on it, but you need to take all of those factors into account, that he has a very stable base that seems to have recovered. And frankly, it's a pretty enviable number. Over 40% for, what are we up to now? I've lost count, 16-year incumbent, depending on where you start counting. That's enviable by any standards for elected leaders.
For sure. I mean, absolutely. I think any politician would pat him on the back for that.
Just to not lose sight of the bigger picture, all polls, all serious polls that are not, in the pocket of the right-wing parties have been showing that the opposition parties currently have a majority, and that has been the case since early 2023. So we can't ignore that trend either. It just doesn't mean that they will be able to form a government because there are so many sensitivities about who goes into the coalition, whether Arab parties will be invited to join or not, probably not, and whether the remaining parties will have a majority in order to form a coalition. All of those things are very, very shaky, but they do have a majority. The majority of Israelis currently, and since the beginning of 2023, have preferred not to support the parties of this current coalition. And that's a dynamic we also need to keep in mind.
Dahlia, maybe this is wishful thinking or a search for the eternal hopeful note to end a podcast on, but do you have any sense that the specter of an impending election is going to motivate Netanyahu any more than it has in the past? We haven't seen much motivation in the past to somehow resolve the situation in Gaza, the situation with the hostages, and look to some sort of view to the future, some sort of vision of the future of the Gaza situation.
Well, I can't speak to what's going on inside his mind, but I can say that from a strategic perspective, he would be very wise if he did look towards an end to the war in Gaza. And that's because the vast majority of Israelis in public opinion surveys are very clear that that's what they want. The number has always shown throughout this war that a majority or a strong plurality of Israelis want to reach a ceasefire in return for hostage release, no matter what kind of conditions are presented in the surveys. But what we've seen in recent months, really ever since Israel broke the last ceasefire deal and refused to move on to the second phase, which would have led to to a permanent ceasefire. But since March, we've seen the number of Israelis who support a full hostage release deal in return for a permanent ceasefire go up to as high as 75%, 3/4 of Israelis. And that's repeated in every survey I've seen. And there are at least 3 from the last, I would say, month, including during the war with Iran, that show almost exactly the same number. And that's an overwhelming majority of Israelis who support an end to the war. There are even survey questions showing that over 60% of Israelis want to end the war, period, whether or not the issue of the hostages is even in the question. So questions that don't even ask about the hostages, but just say, do you think it's time for the war to end? We still see a majority of Israelis who want that. Netanyahu, again, has to make up a few extra percentage points if he wants to actually have a strong chance of forming the next government. His best shot would be to show some sort of responsiveness to the preferences of the vast majority of the Israeli public on this issue. The fact is that even what Israelis consider to be a stunning triumph in the war with Iran practically didn't move his polls at all. His government as a whole got no boost from Iran. It's true that, these regional Israeli military successes helped the government recover back in the spring of 2024, but he seems to have hit a ceiling for about a year now. And so I think that the only chance he really has for getting more public opinion on his side is to reach that very clear equation of hostage release for a permanent ceasefire. And if the major sword hanging over his head is that he'll lose his government and the country will have to go into elections, well, as I mentioned in the beginning, it's not much of a difference anyway, because the elections were scheduled for October 2026, one way or the other. And so he would be wise to do that. I have heard cynical analyses saying he is timing the issue of the ceasefire precisely to match when he wants to engineer elections so that he can have those pictures in people's minds of ending the war and getting the hostages back and making a big show of embracing them. I don't know if that's how calculated and cynical he is. I think Israeli citizens would not want to believe that about their prime minister, but the fact is that too many already do, because surveys also show routinely that a majority of Israelis believe the prime minister has been making his decisions on these issues for political reasons. So we've sort of hit rock bottom in terms of Israeli expectations of their leadership. And despite that, it is not at all clear who will win the next election.
Well, that's a cheery note to end on, Dahlia.
Sorry. I tell it like I see it. I wish it's really not for me to try to explain reality in ways that I want it to be. I think that that's, the realistic approach. And I guess I should say one more thing in answer to your real question about the war in Gaza, which is that even if Netanyahu reaches a ceasefire deal, even if it's a permanent ceasefire deal, and he loses his government and the country goes into elections, which it would have had to eventually anyway, I would caution anybody about assuming that that means some sort of greater resolution to the problem of Israel's effective control over Gaza, or an end to occupation, or a two-state solution, or Palestinian self-determination. He will definitely not want to go there, because from his perspective, that will ruin his chances with his base. He himself is personally opposed to it. So we have to also put that into perspective.
Well, we will. And I recommend that any listeners who want to read even more of your analysis head over to your latest column in Haaretz, which is an excellent explanation of everything that's going on. Dahlia, thanks for coming on the podcast, and thank you for your work.
Thank you for having me again. Always a pleasure.
And that's it for this episode of the Haaretz Podcast. Thanks to my guest, Dr. Dahlia Scheindlin, and producer and editor, Nara Malkin. If you'd like to continue to listen to the podcast and make sure you don't miss an episode, please subscribe to us on Apple or Spotify or wherever you get your podcast. And if you'd like, give us a 5-star rating. That way more people will find us. And to keep up with all the latest news on Israel, the Middle East, and the Jewish world, don't forget to subscribe and follow Haaretz.com. I'm Alison Kaplan-Summer, and until next time, shalom from Tel Aviv.